Great. Thanks so much, Gina. And thank you everybody for attending. As Gina said, this is part 2 of a 2-part webinar. And I'm going to kick things off just by introducing our panelists today. So first we have Karen Kaufman, who's a librarian and professor of library science at Seminole State College of Florida. Next, we have Katie Miller, who's the department head of student learning and engagement, and also of UCF Connect Libraries at the University of Central Florida. And then lastly, myself, Rachel Turnka. I'm an instruction and engagement librarian, also at University of Central Florida. And I'm going to just give a little bit of an outline of what we're going to talk about today. As Gina mentioned, this is part 2. We did part 1, I'd say it was about a year ago, or around this time. And part 1 really covered more of kind of how we came up with the idea, setting up the project and the initial implementation. And then this part is going to focus on our preliminary findings. So if we could go to the next slide. There you go. Okay. So I'm going to start out with just some background and overview. Like I said, a bit of a review of the part 1 webinar. And then also just give kind of a general introduction to our methodology, and then hand things over to Karen, who's going to talk about our preliminary quantitative findings. And then Katie's going to round out the presentation by talking about our preliminary qualitative findings and also talking about our research team takeaways. So starting out with the background and overview, always helpful to kind of begin with our institutional profiles. If we could go back a slide. Thank you. So this is something that I think makes our study a little bit unique in that it is a cross-institutional study. So I think it's helpful just to know a little bit about our respective institutions. So first off, we have Seminole State College, which is a 2-year college, has AA, AS degrees, as well as a 4-year college that has Bachelor of Science, Bachelor of Applied Science degrees. And we also included on this slide the Carnegie class, just because Karen will be talking about that later when she talks about benchmarking. So Seminole State, because it is both 2-year and 4-year, is classified as a baccalaureate associate's college, mixed baccalaureate associates. The student population, around 25,000 students, with a high minority population, so about 50% of the students are minorities, and it is a designated Hispanic serving institution. And then we have University of Central Florida, which is a 4-year metropolitan university offering bachelor's up through PhD degrees. Carnegie class is a research university with very high research activity. We do have a large student population of around 68,000 students. Like Seminole, a high percentage of minority students, so around 49.1%. And we're also a designated Hispanic serving institution. So now that we've kind of talked a little bit about our respective institutions, want to dive into the actual project and the study. So what did we do? As I mentioned in my intro, this is looking at library instruction kind of across 2 different institutions, so a local state college and our public research university. Basically, we got together and decided we wanted to assess library instruction at our institutions using project outcome surveys, and started with this initial research question, which I've included on the slide here. What are the similarities and differences in the perceived value of the library by students at a 2-year and 4-year institution? And just a couple of things to note in there. We were particularly interested in student perception because that was something that maybe we didn't have a lot of data on prior to this project. And also thinking about perceived value. How did the students see the usefulness of what we're doing? So that kind of helped to essentially guide our study. And then moving on from there, just kind of talking a little bit about why we did this. So as I mentioned, really using and getting the student feedback. And I would say at both of our institutions, prior to getting started with Project Outcome, we tracked library instruction probably similar to how a lot of institutions do, by keeping track of the number of sessions, maybe the number of students who attend, maybe a little bit about like the demographics of the students, but not necessarily like a formalized assessment of actual student feedback. So that was something that, was really helpful to us, to use the student feedback to see, what are they actually getting out of the sessions, and, what could we do to improve them? So looking at the quality of the instruction, as well as trying to discover some areas that we could improve on too. And secondly, another reason why we did this study is really the relationship between Seminole State College and UCF. So UCF does have a large transfer student population, and Seminole State College is one of our state college partners. We have a system here called Direct Connect, where essentially students can kind of transfer seamlessly with their AA, AS degree to UCF. And just to give you an idea of kind of the numbers, we have over 14,000 Seminole State student grads have transferred to UCF. So it made a lot of sense for us to be kind of looking at instruction at our institutions, as we have so many students transferring from one institution to another. Another thing that makes it nice here in Florida is that we do have a statewide course numbering system. So we have, the same courses are offered at both institutions, even though the content is slightly different in terms of a numbering system. It makes it a little bit easier, again, to align that. And then finally, just doing some research on this initially, we found that while there is definitely a wealth of literature out there about library assessment of instruction, a lot of it is based on case studies or kind of single institutions, and not a whole lot about cross-institutional studies, and also not a lot dealing with kind of transfer partnerships. So that was something we were excited to explore. And also looking at research that deals specifically with project outcome. So there is on the project outcome website the really helpful resources page that we use that has case studies, kind of explaining again how individual institutions have used the surveys, and we found that really helpful. But again, we're kind of looking for maybe some more information about cross-institutional studies. So that's a little bit about the what and the why. And then kind of moving on from there, who did we decide to study? Because as I mentioned, we have that course numbering system. So kind of deciding what would be a good fit for this project. So we decided to focus just on students in our face-to-face sections of Composition 2 at SSC and UCF, and did that for a couple reasons. So Composition 2, the content of it is a little bit different at the different institutions. So at SSC, it's a little more literature focused. At UCF, it's kind of more traditional writing studies, rhetoric based. But both courses have a significant research project. So again, it made a lot of sense to use that as our starting course. We also wanted to limit things, limit some variables, by just focusing on face-to-face sections. Because as we all know, when you're teaching, say, an online synchronous session, or you're doing embedded library instruction, it's very different. So wanted to try and align things as much as possible. So that was the who, and then the when, excuse me. We focused on the spring 2022 semester. So again, about a year ago is when we actually collected the data. And then kind of rounding out a little bit more about the study, how did we actually implement this? So we used specifically the immediate instruction survey, which has the 4 quantitative questions and 2 qualitative, which both Karen and Katie will be talking in much more detail about. So we used that, and then we also added 1 additional question that was offered on the Project Outcome website. That was administered to students at both institutions through Qualtrics. I just wanted to say a little bit about the Qualtrics part, because again, I know that that's not necessarily the standard typical way of doing it. So we had a couple reasons for doing that. First off is, as we know, when we use project outcome, the data, right, is housed in your respective institutions. So using project outcome alone, right, we would just essentially have our kind of two dashboards or two locations of data. And we thought just for this kind of project that we were doing, it would be helpful to have one centralized location where we could put the data and do some cross-institutional analysis. So that was kind of the first reason. And then the second reason had to do with some assessment procedures that were going on at UCF prior to spring of 2022, that it was determined by our administration that we needed to start instituting some more formalized assessment. So we actually had been doing the immediate instruction survey prior to spring 2022. Everyone who did course-specific library instruction was required to use that. But instead of administering it through a project outcome, our institution decided to do it through Qualtrics, just because we added some additional questions to get some identifying information for the courses. So it kind of made sense, since at UCF we were already using it through Qualtrics, just to keep it there. And in terms of just the logistics, we created a team, since we both had Microsoft Teams at our institutions, and did our collaboration that way, sharing data, just kind of commenting on things and working on our various parts of the project. So that's kind of an overview of really what we talked about in part one, and a little background on the study. And now just want to dive in to the methodology. And as I said, I'm going to just provide kind of a big picture description of it, and then both Karen and Katie are going to dive more in detail. So specifically, our approach to this project is a mixed methods, which I think is no surprise considering the content of the survey itself, right, which has both the quantitative and the qualitative data there. So makes sense to have that mixed method. And more specifically, characterizing it as more of a concurrent study, again, since we were collecting that data, both kinds of data at the same time, and then analyzing it as such. In terms of analysis, how did we do that? So the quantitative data used descriptive analysis to analyze that data, and then the qualitative data did that through thematic analysis. And then just a little bit more about the data before kind of diving in. So essentially, kind of after collecting our data, we basically had our three sets of data. So we had the UCF data, the SSC data, and then the combined cross-institutional data. And the way that we kind of handled this, again, is we uploaded our institutional data separately to the SSC project outcome account, and then the UCF project outcome account, right? So we had it there, and we were able to use all the really helpful tools that are provided through project outcome. So we did our combined quantitative analysis through Qualtrics mainly, and then also a little bit through Excel. And then the combined qualitative data, we analyzed that through Excel. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to Karen, who's going to talk about our preliminary quantitative findings.
Great. Thank you, Rachel. So hopefully you have sort of a sense of where we started, or where we picked up after our first webinar that we shared our experience using project outcome. Let's see if I can get the slides to move. Always good. There we go. All right. So I'd like to start by just giving you a snapshot of, our survey population. We had 31 responses from Seminole State students and 172 responses from UCF students, for a total of 203 valid survey responses. In spring 2022, which is when we administered the survey, Seminole State was just sort of getting back into the on-campus classroom instruction scenario again, post-pandemic. And I'm sure that's true for UCF, but some of our low numbers are because the classes that we were being offered on campus, or those on-campus classes that students had enrolled in were somewhat limited. So that's a little bit of sort of an explanation of the numbers that you see on the screen. We were very pleased actually with our full participant pool responses. So next, I'd like to talk just a little bit about the questions in the survey and the outcomes, the 4 outcomes that the survey specifically is measuring. So there were 4 Likert type questions using a 5-point scale, measuring the impact of these 4 outcomes, which you see in the table on the left are knowledge, confidence, the application of new skills, and awareness of resources. On the right, you see those survey questions that Project Outcome provides in order to measure impact. And so Project Outcome is specific to measure as an assessment or a measurement tool for impact, answering the question, what good did we do? So this is a little bit of a paradigm shift from what traditionally libraries perhaps have been measuring, which are more like outputs or numbers of activities. And Rachel mentioned this a little bit earlier, but maybe gate counts or circulation numbers or event attendance. How much did we do? And then also, oftentimes, libraries are measuring user satisfaction, trying to answer the question, what can we do better? But for the survey that we administered was the instruction survey. So as noted earlier, we were very intentional, and our research question was asking about the impact of information literacy instruction at both the state college and then at the university level for composition 2 courses. Sorry, I keep losing my little arrow. So moving on to our descriptive analysis using both Qualtrics and Excel, we were looking at the cross-institutional data, or those full 203 responses is what we wanted to take a look at. And so we looked at the mean, the standard deviation, and the variance. So you can see the questions again on the left side of the table, and the descriptive statistical analysis provided by Qualtrics. So again, the scale was a Likert type scale 1 to 5. The 1 is the minimum or the lower ranking, and the 5 would be a high level of agreement or strongly agree with answering the question. The means you can see are very, very skewed between the 4 and 5 level category or ranking. And then the standard deviations you can see are low, as well as the variances. And what this is telling us is that we really don't have a normal bell curve. All of our responses are distributed to the very far right of that bell curve. So it's telling us essentially that there most likely were very few 1s or 2s in terms of rating or ranking the student perception of that information literacy instruction experience. And so we were, pleased, of course, to learn about this kind of data collectively. So this is all of those responses together. Next, we're going to start talking about some of the project outcome analysis tools that we used and are continuing to use in our analysis for our preliminary findings. So a project outcome provides several different reporting tools. And one of them is a means or a averages of each of these questions or outcomes that's being measured. And so, as Rachel mentioned earlier, we uploaded our data for each institution separately, and then we gathered that data independently to use in our reporting. So we can see for these questions, this is just the mean of either the strongly agree or agree responses, meaning agree for the 4 rank or 5. And as our previous table with standard deviation and variance indicated, we're very skewed at a very high level of agreement or strongly agreed for each of these questions. So the student's perception of knowledge, confidence, application of new skills and awareness was very, they agreed, let me say it that way, to a very high level. I'm going to keep moving. Additionally, some of the other benchmarking tools that Project Outcome provides are seeing the selected library type averages, a Carnegie class benchmark, a benchmark to national averages, an outcome overview of averages, and then percentage details for each outcome score. So when you get your quick report from Project Outcome, all of this is collated and provided in graphics and numbers in that reporting. And the next slides I'm going to show are just some examples of some of these, not all of these tools. So here's a chart that shows the outcome benchmark by library. And so you can see the graph indicating those 4 outcomes that we're measuring: knowledge, confidence, application of new skills, and awareness of resources, and how both Seminole State and UCF benchmark by library in their for the survey, Project Outcomes survey report. You can note one thing, and I'll talk about this a little more, is confidence for both of our institutions was that one outcome that tended to be on the lower of the high averages, the lower area that we might want to pay attention to as we're giving library instruction. So another benchmark that Project Outcome provides is benchmarking to your Carnegie class, whatever institutional class your institution falls to. Project Outcome provides that benchmark data. So to do that, when you set up your surveys in Project Outcome, there's a tool that helps you identify, if you don't know what that might be. And so it's a very seamless way to get that benchmarking by Carnegie class in your report. You can see here, interestingly, that our Carnegie reports for both Seminole State and UCF are identical. So that was an interesting result that we didn't really anticipate, but that is what our survey responses and results show. Next, I'd like to talk about some of these visuals that help to provide great tools to use when you're speaking about your survey responses with stakeholders or with other people in or outside of your library that you want to show the impact of, in this example, information literacy instruction. This is our instruction survey. And what is this saying? So you can see first this impact matrix in a table form on this slide. And the 4 outcomes that are being measured are indicated across the top. The topic you can see is identified as instruction. Katie, you have your hand up?
Yeah, I just wanted, we have some really good questions in the chat, and although we normally, would like to kind of save them for the end, I think that it might be nice to address some of them now.
Sure.
As you're talking about this section. So the first question was, do you think that a Likert scale tends to elicit more positive responses? And so I will be getting a little bit into this. This was the first question. I will be getting into a little bit of the qualitative questions and how that sort of fleshes that out. So I would like to hold that question to the end. We had a question about why the 5-point Likert scale. And I let the participants know that this is the scale provided by Project Outcome. So we use the resources, the survey that was created by Project Outcome, and they have a very extensive explanation of how those resources were developed. There was a question about how many students were asked to complete the survey from each institution. We kind of, we can't really know definitively, and here's why. Because we schedule a library instruction, the number of students who show up are the number of students who show up. And then we do have some students who are under the age of 18 or who may have declined to participate in the survey. So we don't have an exact figure of like how many students were asked to complete it. I would say just based on kind of the numbers of instructions versus the numbers of respondents, most of the students were kind enough to complete it. Karen, I can't speak for Seminole State, but would that be probably a good, maybe just kind of anecdotal observation?
Yeah, it would be the same at Seminole State. Again, the only factor if they declined most likely was because they were not 18 or older. Yeah. They weren't eligible to participate. And that was part of our IRB, overview, what our IRB directed. And so we had instructions about, who was eligible or not when we administered the survey.
Right. So moving on to the next question, there was a question about wondering about the overlap. For example, if they learn something new to help, then surely they intend to apply. It would be interesting to know if the students did not give similar ratings to these two. That's a great question that I don't think we even thought about. So thank you. So that's going to be really helpful for us as we continue to kind of work through this data. The survey was administered immediately after the instruction. So we touched on this a little bit in part one, but we had like a QR code or a link where the students could go to immediately after the instruction. I can't speak for how it was administered in the other classes, but for example, in the classes that I taught, it was part of a major research project, and the students here have to kind of do their own survey. So it was kind of a beautiful tie-in where we could say, hey, just like you students are having to do this research project and possibly survey and collect data, we do that as part of our growth, as a research institution. So it was immediately after. And in Project Outcome, there are multiple kinds of surveys. So this one was developed for immediately after the instruction. Could you say then how many students attended, how many classes? I could certainly look that up. I don't have that off the top of my head. I'd have to go back and kind of see how many. But we could certainly figure that out, because as part of the data we collected the time of the instruction, the name of the instructor, the institution. So we could kind of go out and sort of figure out how many classes there were. We honestly don't have any way to know how many students attended the library instruction for the reasons that I mentioned before. I mean, we could kind of ballpark it maybe. I think what was the response rate? We don't have like a number that's exact on how many respondents we have. We just sort of, can kind of anecdotally say it seemed like when the responses were coming in, there was a fair number. So I'm sorry if that doesn't quite answer your question, but we were not really looking at it from hitting a certain target of having like 75% of students respond. We were really more interested in, for those who did engage, what was their feedback on it. Karen, I don't know if you have anything to add on that, or Rachel.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great answer. And once again, some of the eligibility things were a factor. And so I would agree with Katie that the response, if we had 10 responses, then we probably would have been more interested in digging into that a little further. But we didn't. Pretty much, if students were eligible, they were agreeable to take the survey. And you'll see again when Katie digs in and presents some of our qualitative data, I think some of the sort of essence or sentiment of the student interest in replying to the survey will be more evident.
And there was time set aside during the instruction to complete this survey. So it wasn't like, here, take the survey and then do it immediately after the class. It was during the class session at the end of the instruction that, at least for the UCF component, where they were given a little time to answer it. So it wasn't something where, you know, if you take some kind of training and they're like at the very end passing out the surveys, it didn't really work that way. Oh, great, Karen. All right, well, I'm going to hand it back over to Karen, our presenter now. Thank you so much for allowing us to kind of address some of these questions.
Oh yeah, no, these are good questions. So we appreciate you interjecting and yeah, speaking up. So Katie, raise your hand again if we need to stop, and we'll do it. Okay, back to the impact matrix tools and reports that are available. So as Katie just mentioned, or maybe it was response to a question, you can see on the left side, the institutions are identified, but then you see topic is instruction. And then this was an immediate survey. Project outcome also offers follow-up surveys. So you have those options with the different types of surveys that are available to use in their toolkit or their toolbox. So then you see to the right after topic and instruction, and those are important elements to identify when you set up your survey, are those outcomes. You see those 4 outcomes noted. You see the colors, little blocks of color. The averages are in numerical form are provided under each of those outcomes for each institution in this slide. And then the overarching average for the responses are provided on the far right side of each table. It is important to note that the colors do matter in this table. The richer the purple, the more correlation or to this outcome is identified. And so although you see the numbers, think about those colors, because in some of the other reports, that also is something to pay attention to. And this is the one for more color coordination for you to pay attention to. So this is called an impact matrix chord. And what these intend to show is the correlation of the 4 outcomes to your topic, which in this case is instruction. So in these little circles with different chords and colors, you'll see identified those 4 outcomes and then how those chords connect to, in this case, the topic instruction. These matrix reports are actually interactive. So if I were not in a static slide and I had this matrix up, if I scrolled across the matrix and across each of these little chords, you'd have a pop-up window that comes up and gives you the detailed data related to that particular outcome to instruction. You know, the averages that we saw in the table, for example. So you can see if you look on the SSC impact matrix on the left, for example, confidence was one of our lower correlated outcomes to instruction. And so it's sort of golden instead of that very rich purple, indicating a lower correlation. The other thing with these chords to pay attention to is the thickness of them. When they're thicker, the correlation is higher to that topic. So you have both color and thickness in the chords to identify that. You can see if you look at the UCF matrix, that if we look at confidence to instruction, once again, it's not as rich a purple because once again, that confidence outcome was not as highly correlated to instruction as some of the other outcomes were. And then finally, there is a word cloud infographic sort of tool that you can choose to use as part of your reporting. And this is especially helpful, I think, when you're speaking to stakeholders or others within the library and trying to advocate for or show the value, what good did we do, you know, when you, for whatever kind of survey you have administered. And in our case, it's an immediate instruction survey specifically for information literacy. And so these, you can see the SSC word cloud and then the UCF word cloud showing the way in which our students responded and some of the way they talk about it, which I love to hear more about how they talk about their information literacy instruction experience, because we can learn about how they're thinking about it when we learn how they talk about it. So that is going to wrap up my section, and I'm going to hand it over to Katie. So
yeah, thank you so much, Karen. So yes, I'm going to talk about the qualitative. As you saw, one thing that Project Outcome doesn't really have is a way to dig deep into those qualitative responses. You can download them from the Project Outcome website into, a CSV or Excel file. So we decided to kind of do a deeper dive. So to kind of recap, there are 3 questions that we selected for our qualitative questions. The first 2 are included in the standard survey. What did you like most about this session? What else could the library do to help you succeed in your classes? And please share one thing you learned today. So the final question, please share one thing you learned today, really kind of touches a little bit on that question that was asked earlier, like what are they intending to do with it, or how do they intend to use this information? We decided, even though the standard questions, there's sort of a think twice sort of paragraph in the project outcome resources, we really felt like this particular question could kind of help us get at that perceived value and maybe shed some light on those similarities and differences that are in our research question. So we decided to go ahead and add on this additional question. I'm looking at the chat. If I understand the workflow, you did all the data collection in Qualtrics. Oh, Rachel, are you answering the chat? I'll let you just tag me if I need to answer anything. I'll try to stop multitasking. All right, so moving on to the next slide. So a little bit answering that question. The survey was exported from Qualtrics into Excel. And then what we did is we separated the responses from the rest of the survey, and we broke them out by question. So the reason for that is because we didn't want to have undue influence, seeing the Likert scale, seeing who taught the class, seeing what institution it came from. We really wanted to do a thematic analysis. So we did have a coding system that allowed us to tie those things back afterwards. But what we did is we broke them out, and I kind of have an example where we've compiled everything back together. This is an example from the question, what did you like most about the session? And then here were the actual comments. And then each reviewer very organically chose terms. So we didn't sit down in advance and try to think about like what words we were going to use. We did this sort of stream of consciousness where we just all put what we thought was the appropriate term to kind of capture what the student was sharing with this comment. So after we had that first pass, those themes or terms were combined into a single column, and they were sorted and counted. All of this was done in Excel. And then the variations of the terms were combined. So if you look at this table, we have the first theme, which had the highest count, which was search strategies. And the different variations were searching, search terms, search phrases. So we just tried to like bring those like terms together and narrow down, because originally we had something like 500 different terms, and obviously that is not going to work in terms of coding. And then based on this count or frequency, we then came together, looked at the different terms that we had, and we decided on 10 sort of overarching themes. So here were the 10 themes that we selected. They were additional service, conference, database, information literacy, interactive, positive interactive, relevant, resources, satisfied, and search strategies. So out of these 10 themes, what we did then is we went back and we recoded everything back from scratch. So if you can go to the next slide. So here you can see we just went completely blank, and using those pre-canned, pre-selected themes, we decided, okay, now we're going to look at them and say, okay, this particular comment meets these different categories. We did have the discussion about should we have multiple codes? Absolutely. So one comment can have multiple codes attached to it or multiple themes attached to it. And the comments, once again, were grouped by question. So then we could see, like, what did students say for each of the 3 questions that we asked. So after we then compiled all of the data from these different themes, what we did then is we came up with sort of where was the summary, where were the different areas where we saw like students really talking about search strategies, talking about confidence, and kind of combined all those. And then moving on to the next slide. Now, we're going to ask you, we're going to do a little exercise here to rank the top 3 themes that would apply to feedback that you might have received on your library instructions. So we're using a system called Slido. You can either join it by doing the QR code that's at the top, or you can do the slido.com with that code, that hashtag there down there at the bottom. So I'll give you guys a few minutes to kind of think about maybe some feedback that you've seen from your library instructions, and what do you guys think really resonates with you from those top 10 themes that we identified? Oh, and did the themes definitions count include positive and negative? Yes. So we did have like if there was any kind of negative feedback that was recorded, or if it was something where, and I'll touch on this a little bit more, where they just said nothing or they had no response. I don't know if that answers your question, Melissa. Maybe when you see sort of the examples that we give, that might help. And if not, please ask in the end of the chat, and we can go in the end of the presentation, and we can go into that. So it looks like in looking at the rankings, you guys are really kind of seeing the same type of themes that we got from our students, that students talk about the search strategies that they learned from the instructions, and that they may mention databases or resources. All right. So thank you so much for participating in our poll. And now I'm going to get into what we learned from the 3 actual questions. So the first one, what did you like most about this session? There were some top themes that were identified. Positive interaction, and that one was frequently about the librarian. For confidence, we really focused on what the students learned. Maybe they expressed sentiments of feeling secure or a better understanding of locating the resources. They may have mentioned explicitly that they acquired some new knowledge. For the interactive or hands-on theme, that was where students told us how much they appreciated time during the instruction to actually do their own searching or to have some kind of hands-on activity. Our students seem to really gravitate towards that active learning, so that was probably why that was such a mentioned comment in our study. And then awareness of resources, where students directly identified how much they appreciated, learning about not only the instruction, but the different library resources that are available for them. Next slide. So I mentioned that they often talked about the instructor. So some common vocabulary, I just thought this might be fun to share, was clear, helpful, informative, enthusiasm, friendly, examples, being thorough. And here's a quote from one of our students. And I don't know if it's a UCF student, we just had a UCF picture. I walked in so afraid for this research project we're working on, and now I can walk out knowing that I understand how to use these resources. So you can see how just this simple comment really touches on those multiple themes. There's an essence of learning something new. There's an essence of confidence. So these are the kind of comments that we got from our students. Moving on to the next question, what else could the library do to help you succeed in your classes? This particular theme solicited the lowest number of responses. So this is the one where 34% did not provide any kind of comment. And when they did, much of it was, how to improve the instruction. Some of them talked about whether, how further instructions would be beneficial. Wow, I learned so much. I think we should have these more often. But then there were also probably a fair number, almost half, where they talked about something completely unrelated to the library instruction. So they talked about, improvements to the collection, talked about the facilities, improve maybe more study rooms, having open hours. And then there were a couple of comments that talked about doing a better job of marketing all of the other things, like the library hours, the services that are available, and so forth. We did get a lot of students who marked, we called this satisfied, but that was where they kind of had that common response, which was there's nothing I can think of. Here they, in many cases they elaborated on on that nothing by saying, oh, I can't really think of anything, but this was really nice as well. For example, in this quote, when the student said she provided many great resources to help me in my class. And then for this final question, once again, as a reminder, this was a question that we added. This is where the top themes really kind of gave us the insight on what students were taking away from the library instruction. So we had search strategies, databases, and awareness of resources as our top themes. So for search strategies, it's probably not going to be a surprise to any of us at this webinar, but they ranged from very, very broad, just talking about they didn't even know about the databases at all, to, about searching at all, or to something that was very, very specific. So they might talk about Boolean search operators or keywords or something like that. So we sort of saw this wide gamut of responses when it came to search strategies. Next slide. And then for databases, the exact same thing. They learned that, they were maybe not aware of the databases in addition to that main search discovery system. So they appreciated learning about those, or they actually named a particular database that they use that will be helpful for them in their research. And then that awareness of resources were things about learning about different services. So like that, we have an Ask a Librarian service or ILL. Those were a lot of the comments that we got when it came to that awareness of resources. Again, things that may not fall into the instruction, but kind of outside, that they may have picked up as part of the instruction that we offered to students. So now we're going to kind of flip it on you guys and ask you to share maybe one thing that you've learned today so far. Once again, you can use the QR code. Yeah, project outcome, I'm going to touch on that a little bit in our takeaways. We have that project outcome has so many reports and resources that are available. Thank you for the idea on how to process that qualitative data. We do have some more sophisticated qualitative data analysis tools available through UCF, but we particularly decided to use Excel because we knew we were going to be doing this webinar and we wanted to create something that would be available for everyone to use, and most people have access to Excel. So that's really interesting. Thank you. We appreciate that. We'll get into the language a little bit. It's certainly project outcome can help with that. All right, and we just have a few minutes, so I want to be sure to hit our takeaway. So we're going to move on to the next slide. Thank you so much for your comments. So yeah, if we can go ahead. So the first takeaway, thank you so much for the comments about checking your data or how you learned about data. It was certainly a learning process for us. As we mentioned, we had to reconcile 3 different types of data sets. So using Qualtrics, using Excel, and then using the project outcomes tools. So our takeaway was to certainly make sure you outline those steps, just as I shared with you during this webinar, making sure that you know how you got from point A to point B when you're walking through that process is incredibly helpful. Secondly, we really learned as a group, to document our methodology and the kind of decisions that we made. I touched a little bit on this, and Karen, did as well when talking about the data. But another example of a sort of a decision that we had to make regarding the methodology was our coding method. So we used an open coding method. So we, at the end, when we came back and we noticed there wasn't necessarily alignment, like all 3 of us didn't necessarily pick the same theme for the data, we decided to include everything. And the reason for that was because we had 3 different perspectives and 2 different institutions. So we had someone who had worked at Seminole State, someone who had worked at both Seminole State and UCF, and then someone who worked at UCF and a different state college. And so we wanted to recognize both those perspectives and the different instructional styles that might generate from that. And that's why we decided to just include everything when we were doing our coding. And then finally, kind of touching back to how important it is to really review those project outcome resources, we didn't realize it until we started working on this webinar, but 2 of our themes that we generated organically actually came from matched the outcomes that were in the quantitative. And if we had kind of thought about this in retrospect, we should have probably included all 4 of them when we were doing that themed coding. So that was sort of we can certainly go back and do that, but it was a little bit of an eye-opening thing, like, wow, we thought we really knew this project outcome resources and everything involved with it. But, you can't always capture that. So really paying attention to that would be helpful. And then finally, the insight on instruction. So we just touched a little bit on this, but this really showed us how we can demonstrate the value and the impact. So in particular, those questions in the students' words, Rachel mentioned at the very beginning of the webinar, how a lot of times it's the number of the instructions or the number of the respondents. What we wanted to really know was what kind of impact are we making on students? Now we have both a qualitative and a quantitative set of data where we can really illustrate how our students see these instructions as valuable, which we can take out into the when we're talking to our administrators or maybe justifying our value to the institution. Karen, Rachel, anything you'd like to add before we move into the questions? I know we just have a few minutes.
I was just actually responding to one of the questions in the chat, but I can just, I guess, respond about the, were there other questions available to include from project outcome that you chose not to use that might have elicited more constructive criticism? Again, that's a good question. I was going to put the link in the chat to actually show you the templates of the surveys. We use the exact template that project outcome provides, and then they do provide additional survey questions, although they caution against, putting too many additional survey questions, which is why we only chose to do 1. So the answer to that question, there weren't any questions that we didn't include that could have elicited more negative feedback. But I think that's a theme that's kind of coming out of the chat, of that it does seem to elicit very positive responses, right? The survey, and that's something definitely that I think is interesting to explore. But again, you get the benefit, as someone else said in the chat, of having a survey instrument that's being used very widely across all these different institutions, so that you can be comparing the data across that, and leaving the hard work of testing the survey essentially to ACRL, right?
Yeah,
so
I would say I very much appreciated the project outcome tools And I think part of it is that our students, like, they're so nice and they're so grateful for the help that they receive that I think sometimes it's hard for them to articulate maybe what they're not getting or sharing what they're not getting. And you know, the stakes on something like this are pretty low compared to maybe an instructional for a course feedback. I don't know if your institution does those, but those can be pretty brutal when there's a grade involved. This is something where, you know, we're just providing a service to them. So yeah, you hope that you're doing a great job, and it is really heartwarming. I wish I could have shared more of the comments. It really does show like what students are taking away from these instructions. You know, you do hear a lot of times that one shots, you know, maybe they don't have the same value that we'd like them to have. This kind of, you know, maybe tips the scales in the other direction, because even though maybe you're not reaching hundreds and hundreds of students, you are making a definitive impact for those particular students by learning skills they didn't know about.
Yeah, I can also just speak for just a second on the cross-institutional value of this particular study. And that is that, you know, we got to see how students at both institutions were responding, but then we also could see how each of our institutions were benchmarking to like institutions. And so it was a really rich way to see a metadata, if you will, analysis. We didn't call it that yet, but anyway, maybe we should. But to be able to recognize, you know, our students at both institutions, our averages were very, very close. And so the information literacy instruction they're receiving, hopefully, is aligning to the courses that, you know, we were instructing before, even though they're very different courses. That hopefully our students are well prepared as they transfer. So that was one thing. I just, in just a last comment, I know we're close to the last couple minutes, so I'll leave it to my research team if they have other things to say.
Well, I don't see any other questions in the chat, but we have our contact information available. If you have any questions, especially like how did you do this, maybe more nitty gritty, please feel free to reach out. Please use the resources from Project Outcome. They are so robust and so helpful. Yes, it was multiple librarians instructing. So we had not only the 3 that you see here as part of the research team, but we had other librarians from the institution who were a part of this survey. So we graciously appreciate their time and letting us put the survey in their class. All right, well, thank you so much. And with that, I think the webinar's concluded.